Don't light the flashlight. Just listen. It's against the back logs again. That's the fourth notch it's carved since the fire died. And we only have 3 miles left to the gap. It's cutting away our path home. There is a place, somewhere between the static and the dark, where old stories settle like sediment into cold mountain water, where the things that happened once upon a trail go down quiet and stay down quiet and wait to be remembered. This is one of those stories. Come in close. Breathe easy. There is nothing to do but listen. Welcome to the redacted archives. It started the way most terrible things start, with a small decision made in the afternoon light that seemed like no decision at all. He'd been walking since just past 6 that morning. His name isn't important. What matters is the pack on his back. 43 pounds of it, and the white blaze painted on the tree ahead of him, and the way his left knee had been talking to him in a low, persistent voice since around mile 9. The trail does that. It finds the weakest thing in you and converses with it, quietly, all day long, until you can't hear much else. He'd been aiming for the shelter at Cutter's Notch. He'd read about it in a dog-eared trail guide found at a hostel in town, and the name had snagged in his mind the way cloth catches on a nail. Sharp, unexpected, difficult to pull free. The guide said it was a 3-sided lean-to, weathered but standing, approximately 16 miles from the nearest road crossing. Remote, quiet, rarely used after summer season. He'd copied the coordinates into his trail journal in careful strokes and told himself it was a destination. What he did not do, and this is the part that matters, the part that lives under everything else in this story like roots beneath frozen ground, was pay attention to the markings on the trees in the 2 miles before the shelter turnoff. He had seen them. He would tell you that plainly. Cut into the bark of old yellow birches along the upper switchback, just where the trail bends hard left and the ground drops away into a long valley of hemlock and white pine. Shallow cuts, notches, 5 in a row on one tree, spaced in a way that seemed deliberate and unhurried, the white inner wood barely showing through the gray bark. He had slowed, reached out and touched the nearest cut, feeling the roughness of fresh wood against his fingertip. This week recent, maybe closer. He had thought, kids probably, a hunter, someone with a knife and too much time. He had not thought about the legend. He hadn't known the legend then. That would come later, in the shelter, in the dark, from an old thru-hiker named Marta, who pressed her back against the near wall and told it in a voice so low He'd had to lean in to hear it over the fire. But that is getting ahead of things. By the time afternoon had started its slow collapse into evening, the fog had begun. It came from the east, which is unusual. Fog on these ridges usually rolls in from the west. But this fog came from the east, slipping between the trees like something with patience and intent. He watched it come while eating trail crackers at a flat rock near a creek crossing. Watched it fill the gaps between the hemlocks on the far bank, and felt the first true chill of the day settle into the back of his neck. Not the comfortable chill of exertion cooling, the other kind. The kind that doesn't go away when you zip up your fleece. He had another 4 miles to the shelter. He could have turned back, retraced to the road crossing, set up his bivvy bag near the second creek, waited for morning. He knew this. But there is something in a person that mistakes forward motion for safety, that believes if you keep walking, you'll eventually walk through the trouble and out the other side. He had that thing in him. He just hadn't been shown what it cost. The last light went somewhere around 7. Not dramatically. It simply withdrew, politely. One moment there was a gray, gauzy light through the wet canopy. The next there was only the narrow cone of his headlamp, and everything else was black. Not the friendly black of a room you know well. The territorial black of old-growth forest, which has its own weight and temperature and presses against the edge of your light like something curious and unconcerned. He found the shelter by the reflective blaze marker and followed the blue-blazed side trail down a short, steep pitch to the clearing where the lean-to stood. Marta was already there. She was perhaps 65, perhaps older. Silver-white hair in a loose braid, and a face lined and deeply calm. The kind of calm that isn't the absence of fear, but something built on top of it over a long time. She was feeding the small fire ring with methodical movements, laying each piece of wood as though placing something fragile. She looked up when he came in and said, "You're late." He said he knew. She said, "You saw the marks on the birches, up on the switchback." He set his pack down on the right-hand platform and looked at her across the fire. He said, "I saw some cuts." "Yeah." She was quiet for a while. Then she told him about the notch cutter. She told it the way you tell something you've carried for years, without drama, with the flatness of a thing you've stopped trying to disbelieve. The old-timers along this section of trail, she said, the ridge runners, the shelter maintainers, the families who'd farmed these coves going back 5 generations, they didn't talk about it much to outsiders, but they all knew it. The way they knew which streams ran dry in August and which game trails not to follow after dark. It comes to the shelters, she said, the open front ones, not the cabins, the lean-tos, the ones where there's nothing between you and the outside world but 3 walls and whatever you brought with you. It comes to the back wall, the exterior side. You won't see it. The fog is where it lives, or what it wears, or what it is. But you'll hear it, if the fire has died enough, if the night is quiet enough. Carving, she said, into the backlog of the shelter wall. Counting down, she said. Not days, not years, miles. The miles of clear thinking you have left before the trail stops making sense, before the white blazes lead you in circles, before the map and the ground come apart like wet paper. It measures something in you and takes it away, one notch at a time. And when the last notch goes down, you walk out into the dark and you don't come back. She said this last part very quietly. The fire was low by then. He told himself it was folklore, trail mythology, the kind that accumulates in remote places the way moisture accumulates on cold stone. Natural, inevitable, not evidence of anything. He told himself this with some conviction, lying in his sleeping bag on the right-hand platform, listening to the fog settle against the open face of the shelter like slow, patient breathing. He did not tell himself this for very long. The first scrape came at what he guessed was 11 o'clock. He had been drifting, that shallow, unreliable drifting that passes for sleep when you're cold, and listening even when you don't mean to be. The fire was embers. Marta was a still shape across the shelter, breathing in the long, measured rhythm of actual sleep. And he heard it, quieter than he'd expected. He'd been braced for something loud, something clearly external and wrong. Instead, what he got was something almost indistinguishable from the settling of old wood in cold air. Almost, except that wood settles in single random ticks, and this was sustained, deliberate, rhythmic. A drawing sound, something moving along the grain of timber in a slow, considered line, pausing and moving again, like someone who had done this many times before and saw no reason to hurry. The back wall of the lean-to was perhaps 8 inches from the back edge of the sleeping platform. 8 inches of old hand-hewn timber between the inside of the shelter and whatever was outside it. He lay perfectly still and felt those 8 inches in a way he had never felt physical space before, as both infinitely thin and impossibly vast, as a distinction between 2 states of being that had suddenly become fragile beyond any reasonable reassurance. He did not move. He did not call out. He did not light his headlamp. He breathed. The scraping went on for perhaps a minute, and stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The fog, when he finally dared click his headlamp on briefly and point it outward, could not be penetrated beyond 4 or 5 feet. Just gray. Just the breathing, featureless gray. Marta said without turning over, "First one." He said, "What?" She said, "That was the first one. Go back to sleep if you can." He could not. The second notch came perhaps an hour later, though time had become unreliable, elastic in the way it gets in the deep hours of a sleepless night outdoors, where 10 minutes feels like an age, and an hour collapses into nothing. The sound was the same, deliberate, patient, the slow, careful language of something that understood grain and timber and the precise pressure required to cut clean without splitting. A craftsman's sound. That was the worst part, that it sounded like craft, like whatever was pressed against the back wall was not acting from malice or frenzy, but from terrible, focused intention. After the second notch, the fog tightened. He was sure of it. A thickening at the open face of the shelter that made the darkness feel closer and more deliberate. The smell changed, too. The clean, cold scent of rain-wet pine shifting toward something older and deeper. Something that reminded him, without logical basis, of turned earth. He ran the calculation over and over. 3 miles to the road gap. 3 miles of trail through fog so thick he could not see his hand at arm's length. In the black, with nothing to follow but the white blazes on the trees. And Marta had said, "That's what the notches count down. The miles of clear thinking you have left before the blazes stop making sense, before the trail folds back on itself and leads you somewhere the map has no name for." The third notch came. He counted afterward, without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, and the trail back to the gap was 3 miles long. He thought about that correspondence for a long time, lying still in the dark. He thought about the marks on the birches, 5 in a row, and wondered who had lain in this shelter before him, how many nights it had taken, what they had done when the last notch came down. The fog was inside the shelter now, not fully, not visibly, but he could feel it on his face, feel the cold deepening, feel the last of the embers go from dull orange to nothing, as though even that small warmth had been quietly, carefully discouraged. The smell of damp pine pitch was strong, the smell of cold stone, the smell of old wood slowly yielding to patient work. He did not run, not as boast, not as confession, as fact. He understood in the deep, wordless part of himself that fear sometimes opens, that running was exactly the wrong thing. The dark and the fog and the confusion were the conditions the counting down was preparing, not for something the entity would do to him, for something he would do to himself. So he stayed still. He breathed. He thought about home, the road crossing 3 miles north, his truck in the parking lot, dry clothes in the cab, a half-eaten bag of chips on the passenger seat. He thought about these things with great care and specificity, because specificity is an anchor, because the detailed and ordinary world is the rope you hold when everything else is pulling you toward the unmapped edge. The 4th notch came just before the dark began to thin. He knew it was the 4th. He'd been counting every silence since the 3rd. And when the scraping began again, he said to himself quietly, without emotion, 4. And the open face of the shelter seemed to him at that moment not a missing wall, but a threshold, a door standing permanently open onto something with no interest in being seen, but every interest in being heard. And he pressed himself flat and felt the faint vibration of the tool working 8 inches away, and did not move. And then it stopped. The fog retreated the way a tide retreats, not from defeat, but because its cycle had run its course. The darkness went from absolute to merely deep, then from deep to the flat gray that precedes dawn on an overcast mountain morning. And the nearest trees resolved slowly out of nothing into shapes, and the shapes became trees, and he breathed out a breath he felt he'd been holding for hours. Marta was sitting up with her knees drawn to her chest, looking at the back wall. She said, "Go look." He looked. 4 notches, fresh cut into the old gray exterior timber, clean, precise, evenly spaced. The tool marks were fine and careful, the wood pale and raw at the cuts, the surrounding surface dark with age and moisture. They were, in their way, beautiful, the way terrible, careful things can sometimes be beautiful, the way anything that has taken its time carries a quiet authority. He said, "What happens when the last one goes down?" Marta pulled on her boots and laced them slowly. She looked at him with the look of someone who has carried something a long time and knows there is no good way to set it down. She said, "Nobody who's had the last one carved has ever been able to tell anyone." He nodded. She said, "We leave now, while the trail still makes sense." And they did. So now you know the story of the notch cutter and what it waits for in the fog along that remote stretch of trail in the old 3-sided shelter where the logs are ancient and the fire ring goes cold, and the back wall holds the quiet record of every countin' down it has ever done. And if you ever walk that stretch, if you come to a shelter at the end of a long day, with the fog rolling in from the east, and a voice in the practical part of you saying there is still time to turn back, you know to listen to that voice. But you are not on that trail tonight. You are here in the warmth, with the weight of the day settling off your shoulders like a pack set down at the end of a long walk. The sounds around you are familiar sounds, safe sounds. The dark behind your eyes is a friendly dark, a dark that has held you before and will hold you again now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. There is nothing counting tonight, nothing keeping track, nothing pressing against the other side of any wall. There is only the slow, settling quiet of a world that has put down its work and has nothing left to do but rest. Go easy. Go slow. The trail will be there in the morning.